I was always the type of person who needed to prove something to myself. That's what my therapist said anyway. And maybe that's why I accepted the challenge from my older brother Michael, a 5-day solo camping trip through the Mackinac National Forest. No technology, no communication, just me and the wilderness. I was 26, worked a dead-end job at a call center, and spent most nights scrolling through social media in my apartment. Michael's words stung. You need to find out if you're actually capable of anything. So here I was, 3 days in, exactly where I wanted to be. I'd set up my tent in a small clearing surrounded by massive red pine and birch trees. The clearing was about 40 feet across, which felt like an anomaly in the dense forest. Too perfect, almost. But I wasn't about to question my good fortune. I'd hiked 12 miles that day, and my legs were screaming. The first night had been peaceful. I'd built a modest fire, cooked some freeze-dried pasta, and fell asleep to the sound of wind through the trees. The second day, I had explored the perimeter, marked my route with orange tape, and tried to catch some pictures of wildlife for my brother. I saw deer, some birds, the normal forest stuff. That night, I heard something I didn't recognize. A howl, distant and low. A wolf? I knew there were some in Michigan, though they were rare. I told myself it was probably a dog from a distant cabin. I slept fine anyway, but on the third night, things shifted. I remember being jolted awake around 2 a.m. Something had startled me awake, but I couldn't identify what. My tent was silent, except for my own breathing and the ambient forest sounds. I lay there for about 20 minutes, trying to force myself back to sleep, telling myself it was probably an animal passing through. But then I noticed something odd. There were footsteps outside my tent, not the light patter of an animal. These were deliberate human footsteps, crunching on the dry forest floor, moving slowly around my tent in a wide circle. My heart immediately accelerated. I grabbed the flashlight beside my sleeping bag, but I was terrified to turn it on. What if someone or something was out there? What would turning on the light accomplish except to confirm my location? The footsteps continued their circle, slow and measured. Once, twice, 3 times around. Then they stopped. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. I lay there with the flashlight in my hand, too frightened to use it, staring at the fabric of my tent, waiting. The sun felt like it took an eternity to rise, but when the gray dawn light finally started filtering through the trees, I felt the first moment of relief since waking. I unzipped my tent cautiously and panned my flashlight across the clearing. The forest floor in front of my tent was completely undisturbed, no footprints, no signs of anything. I sat outside for hours that morning, going through explanations in my head. Wind could have made those sounds. My mind, partially asleep, could have invented the footsteps. I was dehydrated, probably. Altitude sickness, low blood sugar, anything but the obvious explanation. Someone had been walking around my tent in the middle of the night. I needed to stay calm. I was only 2 days away from my planned exit point. I could make it. That's what I kept telling myself as the day wore on. That afternoon, as I was collecting firewood about 50 yards from my tent, I found something. A cigarette butt. Not old, recent. The paper was still white, not weathered. I stood there holding this small piece of evidence, my mind racing. Smokers didn't typically venture this deep into the wilderness, and there was no trail I could see leading to this spot, just thick forest in every direction. I told myself to leave immediately. Pack up, forget the planned route, just head toward the nearest road. But then I thought about Michael's comment about being incapable. I thought about going back to my apartment, admitting I'd quit early, letting him win. I hated that feeling more than I hated the fear creeping up my spine, so I stayed. I told myself I'd stay one more night, and if nothing happened, I'd pack out the next morning as planned. That night, I built my fire larger than usual. I kept it burning hot, the flames jumping high, and I moved my tent closer to it, though the heat was almost unbearable. I sat by the fire until nearly 1 a.m., unable to convince myself to go inside. The forest beyond the firelight was an absolute void, completely black. I kept thinking about those footsteps, about the cigarette butt, about the wrongness of finding any sign of human presence in this place. Around 1:30, I forced myself into the tent. My hands were shaking as I zipped it up. I positioned myself in the center of the sleeping bag, the flashlight immediately in hand. I don't know how much time passed before I heard it again. The footsteps. But this time, there was something else. Breathing. Heavy, deliberate breathing. Right outside the tent wall where my head was. Someone was standing just feet away from me, breathing loudly, as if they wanted me to hear them. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it at the tent wall, but the beam just lit up the fabric. I could still hear the breathing, rhythmic and deep. My vocal cords felt paralyzed. No sound came out when I tried to scream. Instead, I just lay there, flashlight in a shaking hand, listening to this person breathe, separated from me by nothing but nylon and thread. Then the breathing stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I waited in that silence for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Then I heard footsteps again, moving away from the tent, across the clearing. I forced myself to wait another minute, just 1 minute before turning off my flashlight and slowly unzipping the tent. The clearing was empty. The fire had burned down to embers, providing the faintest light. I could make out the perimeter of trees surrounding the clearing, just shapes in the darkness. No movement, no sound. But there was something different about the clearing now. Something about its geometry seemed wrong. The tree line seemed closer than it had been before, as if the clearing had shrunk somehow. I told myself that was impossible, that it was just the darkness playing tricks on my perception. I packed that night, just grabbed what I could stuff into my backpack without even rolling up my tent properly, left the rest behind, and started walking in what I hoped was the direction of the main trail. My phone had no signal out there that had been the whole point, so I couldn't use it to navigate. I just walked, following the general shape of the terrain downhill, trying to remember the route I'd come in on. I walked for hours. The forest was so dark that I could only see about 10 feet ahead with my flashlight. At several points, I thought I was retracing my own footsteps. Trees started to look familiar. Fallen logs I was certain I'd seen before appeared again. The forest seemed to be looping back on itself, or I was going in circles. I couldn't tell which. That's when I found the clearing again. It was unmistakable. My tent was still there, partially collapsed. The fire I'd abandoned was still smoldering. I'd somehow walked in a complete loop through the forest and ended up exactly where I'd started. I sat down on a log, unable to process what this meant. I'd walked in a straight line, or what I thought was a straight line, for hours, in the general direction I remembered. It should have been impossible to circle back. Unless I hadn't gone in a straight line. Unless the forest had somehow guided me back. Unless I heard a sound. Not footsteps this time. A voice. It sounded like Michael's voice, calling my name from the darkness beyond the clearing. "Come on, you can do this. You're capable. Come on." I stood up and moved toward the sound, toward the tree line, my flashlight swinging ahead of me. But the voice seemed to move as I moved, always just at the edge of hearing, always calling from beyond the next line of trees. I walked into the forest again, following that voice. I don't know how long I walked after that. At some point, I realized the voice had changed. It didn't sound like Michael anymore. It sounded like it was coming from inside my own head, my own voice, telling me to keep going. And I kept going, because at that point, I honestly wasn't sure I could stop. They found me on the 5th day of my trip. I was about 4 miles from my original clearing, delirious and severely dehydrated. I had no memory of getting there. My tent and supplies were never found. I don't remember anything after hearing Michael's voice calling me into the forest. The official story was that I'd gotten lost, wandered for days, and gotten lucky that a park ranger stumbled upon me. I told them I didn't remember much, that the stress of being lost had caused some kind of dissociative episode. They seemed to accept this explanation, though I could see the concern in their eyes. Michael picked me up from the hospital. We didn't talk much on the drive home. When we got to my apartment, he finally said, "So, you learn anything about yourself out there?" I looked at him, and for just a second, I could have sworn his expression was off somehow. His smile was at a strange angle. His eyes reflected light in a way that didn't seem quite right. "Yeah," I said. "I learned that some places don't want you to leave." He stopped smiling. Just for a moment, I watched his face change. It was subtle, a slight twitch, a darkening in his pupils, a tension in his jaw. Then his expression reset back to normal. "That's weird," he said. "That's a really weird thing to say. I haven't been back to Michigan since, but sometimes late at night I hear that breathing. The heavy, deliberate breathing I heard outside my tent, and I swear I can smell the forest. Pine and earth and something else, something rotten, even though I'm inside my apartment in Columbus with all the windows closed. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear a voice calling my name. Michael's voice, or my own voice. I can't ever tell the difference.
I told you this wasn't safe.
It is perfectly safe. Stop overreacting.
Look at the ice, it's cracking.
The house was beautiful in a way that felt like it was trying too hard. All glass and steel and clean lines, sitting on a promontory that jutted out into the lake. My wife Claire had rented it for our anniversary 2 weeks alone in rural Ontario, far from our jobs, far from everyone. We'd been married for 7 years, but the last 2 had been careful, polite. We sat in separate rooms reading our separate books and called it self-care. Claire thought this trip would fix things. I wasn't sure anything could anymore. The house manager, a severe woman with white hair who introduced herself as Dorothy, walked us through the essential systems when we arrived. Heat, water, the generator for backup power, the satellite internet in the study. She emphasized the internet, said it was crucial since the property was too remote for regular cell service. She explained the pantry was well stocked, and the caretaker wouldn't return until our checkout day. The lake is completely frozen, Dorothy said, standing at the wall of glass that faced the frozen expanse. Safe to walk on, though I wouldn't recommend going too far from shore. You never really know where the weak spots are. I found this comment oddly specific. Claire didn't seem to notice it. She was already mentally unpacking, moving through the open floor plan, like she was already imagining our life here, even though we were only staying 2 weeks. After Dorothy left, the silence of the house felt profound, absolute. We were truly alone, no neighbors within a quarter mile, dense forest on 3 sides, frozen lake stretching out for maybe a mile until distant shoreline appeared through the afternoon haze. That first night was good. We made dinner together for the first time in months. We drank wine and talked about memories from early in our marriage. The house, despite its architectural coldness, provided a cocoon of comfort. The heating system made barely audible humming sounds. Outside, frost gathered on the windows. By the second day, the house felt less like a refuge and more like a theater set. Everything too carefully arranged, too picture perfect. Claire had suggested we take a walk on the lake. It was a bright, clear morning, and the expanse of white ice looked clean and inviting. I bundled up, and we ventured out about 50 yards from the shore, Claire's hand in mine. "It's so quiet," she said. "I forgot places like this existed." We stood in the center of the frozen lake, the house visible behind us, perfectly framed in the distance like a postcard image. Claire closed her eyes. I remember thinking, at that exact moment, that this was what she'd wanted. Not the house, not even the trip. Just this. To feel removed from the world, untethered. "I heard something," she said suddenly, opening her eyes. "What?" "Under the ice. I swear I heard something." I pressed my ear to the ice. "Nothing. It's just ice settling," I said. "Normal." But we went back to the house anyway. That night, things started to feel off. Small things. Claire said she'd made a cup of tea before dinner and left it on the bathroom counter. When she went to retrieve it, the cup was in the kitchen, empty, in the sink. She said she must have forgotten she'd already drunk it, but her voice had a questioning tone, like she wasn't entirely convinced by her own explanation. "These old rental houses," I said. "They probably shift and settle. Maybe you walked past it again without realizing." She nodded, but I could see the tension in her shoulders. The next morning, she showed me something. The thermometer on the bedroom wall read 46 degrees Fahrenheit, even though we'd set the heat to 70, but when I touched the radiator, it was hot. "That can't be right," I said. "That's what I thought, but I checked it an hour ago and it still said 46. I went to the thermostat in the main room and adjusted it, waited for it to register. The digital display showed 71 degrees, and I could feel the heat running. "It's fine," I told her. "The bedroom thermometer is probably just broken." Claire didn't argue, but I caught her looking at the thermometer again as we left the bedroom. By day 4, the small wrongnesses had accumulated into a pattern I couldn't ignore. Doors that we distinctly remembered closing were open. The satellite internet would work perfectly for an hour, then disconnect completely for hours at a time. The refrigerator began making a sound like something breathing inside it. And most unsettling, the lake. The lake had changed. This was difficult to explain, even to myself. The ice had developed what looked like cracks, not the normal spiderweb pattern of cracks that form on frozen water, but deliberate lines, geometric forming shapes. I could see them clearly from the windows. Lines that seemed to curve around the house in concentric patterns. I didn't point this out to Claire, but she'd seen them too. "It's just how ice cracks," she said, and her voice had taken on that questioning quality again, like she was trying to convince herself more than me. On the 5th night, I was reading in the living room when I heard Claire cry out from upstairs. I bolted up and found her standing in the hallway, pointing at the bathroom. The mirror, a massive frameless mirror above the sink, was now completely frosted over, covered in what looked like ice crystals from the inside. "How is that possible?" she asked. I looked at the temperature dial on the wall. It read 38 degrees. The thermostat downstairs still showed 71. The radiator was still hot to the touch. We spent that night in the living room, closer to the heating system, not discussing what we were both thinking. That something in this house was fundamentally wrong. That the building itself was behaving in ways that violated basic physical laws. The next morning, I made a decision. "We're leaving," I said. "What?" "No, we have another week." "I don't care. There's something wrong with the house. The heating system is broken, or there's something with the windows, or I don't know what, but this isn't safe." Claire looked at me for a long moment. "You're scared," she said, not unkindly. "Yes," I admitted. "I'm scared." She nodded slowly. "Okay, let me pack." But here's where things get weird. When I went to get the car keys from the dish by the door, they weren't there. I turned the house upside down. We checked the car to see if maybe I'd left them in the ignition. Nothing. We searched every drawer, every shelf, every possible place I might have left the keys. They were simply gone. I tried calling for help on the satellite internet, but the system had crashed completely. No amount of resetting would bring it back online. My phone had no signal. We were definitively stranded. That night, Claire wouldn't look at me. "You had the keys when we arrived," she said quietly. "Remember? Dorothy watched you put them in that dish." "I know, but they're gone. You lost the keys." I wanted to argue, but she was right. Somehow, impossibly, the keys had vanished. And with them, my certainty about what was happening in this house. The next morning, I found Claire standing at the window, staring out at the frozen lake. The cracks had changed again. Now they formed a shape, unmistakably, that looked like a face. Not a realistic face, but a portrait face, with eye sockets and a mouth, all rendered in the frozen lines of the lake. "It's just how the cracks happen to form," she said, and her voice was steady. "Pareidolia, the human mind looking for patterns." "Claire, we're going to be fine," she said, still looking out at the lake. "The caretaker will come back in a few days. We'll explain about the keys, and we'll leave. It's all going to be fine." But that night, I heard her crying in the bathroom. When I went to check on her, she was standing in front of the mirror, which had unfrosted somehow, the inside of it now clear and staring at her own reflection. "Are you okay?" I asked. She didn't turn around. "Do you think people can change while staying exactly the same?" she asked. "What do you mean?" "I mean, can you be in a place where you're not changing, not growing, not becoming anything, and stay that way indefinitely? Can a person just freeze?" I realized she wasn't really asking me. She was asking the person in the mirror. On the 8th day, we'd stopped counting the exact day and just started saying day something. I realized the house was smaller than it had been when we arrived. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what was different, but moving through the rooms felt different. Rooms that had seemed far apart when we arrived now seemed adjacent. The hallway upstairs that I remembered being at least 30 feet long now seemed to be only 20. I didn't mention this to Claire. She'd stopped leaving the living room during the day. She'd sit by the window, watching the lake, watching the geometric cracks spread further, watching the face that was now clearly visible in the ice become more defined, more aware. I caught her speaking to the window once, her lips moving soundlessly, her hand pressed flat against the glass. I should have left. I know this now. I should have broken a window, crossed the frozen lake on foot, despite the warnings about weak spots, and walked until I found civilization. But there was something about this place, some quality of inevitability, that made leaving seem both necessary and impossible. On what would have been day 12, satellite internet came back online. Just like that, as if nothing had been wrong. I immediately tried calling for help, but the line wouldn't connect. The screen just showed a message. "User not authorized from this location." That night, Dorothy returned. She opened the door using a key we didn't know she had. and walked in like she owned the place, which I suppose she did, in a manner of speaking. She looked at us, Claire sitting by the window, me standing uselessly in the middle of the room, and didn't seem surprised by anything. "How was your stay?" she asked, removing her white parka. "The keys," I said. "My car keys went missing. And the house, there's something wrong with the house." Dorothy looked at me with an expression of pity. "What are you talking about?" "The temperature fluctuations, the mirror frosting over, the cracks in the ice. We should discuss the deposit," she said, interrupting me. She turned to Claire. "Your wife paid with a credit card?" I looked at Claire. "What did you tell her?" But Claire was still looking at the window, at her reflection, at the geometric cracks in the lake beyond. "I want to leave," I said. "Right now. I'll walk if necessary." Dorothy removed something from her pocket. "My car keys." "These?" she said. "Found them in the snow out front this morning. You must have dropped them when you were getting something from the car." I looked at the keys in her hand. They were impossible. I'd searched everywhere. More importantly, I knew with absolute certainty that I'd put them in that dish when we arrived. But I took them from her. "Safe travels," Dorothy said. And she smiled. We drove back to the city in silence. Claire stared out the window at the landscape passing by. I kept my hands on the wheel and tried not to think about the house, about the frozen lake, about the face made of cracks. But sometimes I dream about that lake. And in the dreams, the ice is melting, and underneath it, there's something vast moving in the dark water. Something that's been waiting. And every now and then, Claire will turn to me in the morning light, and for just a fraction of a second, I'll see her reflected in her own eyes, as if she's looking at me from very far away. And I know I'm certain that something came back with us from that house. She's still there. She's still standing by the window, watching the cracks spread. And she's very patient. I'm writing this to explain what happened, though I'm not certain anyone will believe it. I'm not certain, I believe it, and I lived through it. My name is Thomas, and this is the story of the summer I bought the house on Ashford Lane. It was a Friday when I first saw the property. The estate agent, a young woman named Rebecca, met me at the curb. She kept checking her phone, seemed eager to move through the viewing. The house itself was unremarkable, a 1,960-second semi-detached with a small front garden, sitting on a quiet cul-de-sac in Manchester. The asking price was unusually low for the area, which should have been my first warning. "Why so cheap?" I asked as she unlocked the front door. "The market's soft," she said quickly. "And it's been on the market for a while. The previous owners have already moved on. They just want it sold." The interior was clean, recently painted, with new carpeting in the main rooms. Everything about it was designed to appeal to someone like me, divorced, working from home, looking for a fresh start in a place without memories attached. I bought it a week later. The move was straightforward. I hired a small moving company, unpacked slowly, took my time arranging furniture in rooms that felt like they were waiting for me to make decisions about their purpose. The house seemed to settle around me. I established routines: morning coffee in the kitchen, afternoon work in the study, evening walks through the cul-de-sac. By the second week, I noticed the first odd thing. I kept finding items in my house that I didn't remember buying. A blue ceramic mug in the back of a cabinet, a pen, specifically a fountain pen with an unusual weight, on the bathroom counter, a paperback book, a mystery novel from the 1,980 seconds in the linen closet. These items had the quality of being both new and old. Not covered in dust, but not fresh either. Like they'd been placed there deliberately, waiting for me to find them. I told myself that maybe they'd been left by the previous owners, remnants they'd missed during their move. Reasonable explanation. I removed them. But there were more the next week. Different items. A small framed photograph of a family I didn't recognize. A cassette tape with no label. A pair of reading glasses, prescription lenses, resting on the kitchen table. And then the notes began. The first one was in the bedroom, on my nightstand, in handwriting I didn't recognize. "It's okay to be here. You're safe." I checked all the doors and windows. They were locked. My security system showed no signs of breach. The note was printed in blue ink, on ordinary paper, written in what looked like an elderly person's handwriting. I threw it away. The second note appeared 2 days later. "Keep the doors locked. After dark." I was now genuinely frightened. Someone had been in my house, someone with access. I contacted the police, but they pointed out that there'd been no theft, no vandalism. The notes, while disturbing, weren't technically threatening. They advised me to upgrade my locks and install a security camera. I did both immediately, and the notes stopped for a while. But the other phenomena didn't. I started experiencing what I can only describe as lapses in memory. I'd begin a task loading dishes into the washer, for example, and suddenly find myself in a completely different room with no memory of how I'd gotten there or how much time had passed. Sometimes it was minutes. Sometimes I'd lose hours. More disturbing were the moments when I'd discover evidence of my own presence in rooms I didn't remember entering. A coffee cup on a shelf in the spare bedroom, scratches on the wooden floor in the study, as if furniture had been moved. The television on in the living room, tuned to a channel I never watched. The remote on the sofa, as if someone had been sitting there. That someone, apparently, was me. I made an appointment with my GP, described the symptoms, memory loss, dissociation, fugue states. He prescribed a mild anti-anxiety medication and suggested I might be stressed from the house purchase, that my mind was playing tricks on me. Sometimes, a major life change can manifest in unexpected ways, he said, in that tone of voice doctors use when they think you might be a hypochondriac. I took the medication faithfully. I did meditation. I tried to convince myself that the notes were coincidences, probably from a previous owner, now falling out of ceiling cracks or whatever. But then came the night I found myself in the basement. I have no memory of going downstairs. One moment, I was in bed, reading a book. The next moment of consciousness, I was in the basement, in near total darkness, my bare feet on concrete, my fingers touching the cold brick of the outer wall. It took several minutes for my eyes to adjust enough to see shapes. The basement was unfinished, mostly empty except for the boiler and some storage shelves. And standing in the corner, in a shaft of pale streetlight coming through the small basement window, was a figure, a person, perfectly still, hands at its sides, staring directly at me. I don't remember screaming. I don't remember running up the stairs. I remember opening my eyes in my bed, gasping, my heart in my throat, with absolutely no recollection of how I'd gotten back upstairs, but I'd left muddy footprints up the stairs from the basement. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with every light in the house turned on, my phone in my hands, trying to decide if I should call the police. But call them and say what? That I'd found myself in my basement in the middle of the night? That there had been a figure in the corner? I had no proof the figure was anything but a hallucination, a particularly vivid waking nightmare. Morning came like a reprieve. In daylight, the house seemed normal again, almost innocent, but I'd made a decision. I was going to sell the house. I didn't care if I took a loss. I'd contact a realtor, and I'd get out. But when I tried to call Rebecca, the number was disconnected. The estate agent's office had closed down. The number that came up as their phone line now connected to a business that had been operating at that location for 3 years. It was as if the company that had sold me the house had never existed. I tried to find records online, but there was nothing. No archived website, no Google results, nothing. The sale documents I had were real. I'd reviewed them with my own lawyer, but the agent and company had effectively vanished. That's when I realized something had fundamentally broken in my understanding of reality. I made an appointment with a psychiatrist, a proper one, not my GP. I told him everything, the memory losses, the figure in the basement, the impossible disappearance of the company that sold me the house. He listened carefully, and when I finished, he asked a question I wasn't expecting. Thomas, do you think it's possible that this house might be aware of your presence in some way? I stared at him. That's a ridiculous question. Is it? He said. You're describing symptoms that suggest your mind is fragmenting, but they're also consistent with external stimulus you're struggling to process. What if the boundary between your consciousness and the house's space has become permeable? I walked out of his office and never went back. The next month was the worst of my life. The episodes became more frequent. I'd lose hours at a time. When I'd return to consciousness, I'd find evidence of activities I had no memory of engaging in. A dinner I'd cooked but not eaten. Boxes of books I'd apparently unpacked and rearranged. A wall in the spare bedroom I'd apparently painted a soft gray color I have no memory of owning. And the person in the basement returned. Over multiple nights, or was it one night repeated, I'd find myself back in that basement and the figure would be there. At first, it maintained its distance, but night after night, it seemed to move closer, getting slightly less abstract, developing features. One night, I saw its face clearly. It was an elderly woman with kind eyes. She had white hair and wore clothing from decades past, and she smiled at me with profound sadness. I tried to speak to her. "Who are you?" I asked. "I've been waiting for you to see me," she said. Her voice was thin, almost whispered. "Why?" "Because this is the only place I can exist anymore. And you're here now, so I can finally leave." I woke up in my bed, morning light outside the windows, with absolutely no memory of returning upstairs. The fear became so overwhelming that I stopped leaving the house. I stopped working. I stopped eating regularly. I existed in a state of perpetual dread, waiting for the next fugue, the next discovery of something impossible, the next encounter with that woman in the basement. My employer called to check on me. I fabricated an illness. My sister contacted me after I missed her birthday. I told her I was fine. Everyone seemed very far away now, separated from me by something thicker than distance. And then one day, I think it was a Tuesday, I woke up and realized something. I wasn't sure if I was asleep anymore. I'd become uncertain about the difference between waking and dreaming. The light in the windows never quite seemed right. The sounds of the house, the pipes, the settling walls, the refrigerator. Hum had taken on a rhythmic quality that seemed almost deliberate, almost communicative, and the woman was always there now. Every moment, at the edge of perception. Sometimes I'd see her in the hallway. Sometimes she'd be visible in mirrors, standing just behind me. Sometimes I'd feel her hand on my shoulder, cool and light as paper. "I'm sorry," she'd whisper. "I didn't know how else to tell you." "Tell me what?" I'd ask. "That it's time to go now. Your turn is over." I realized, with a clarity that was more terrifying than anything else I'd experienced, that I couldn't actually remember the last time I'd left the house. I couldn't remember feeling the sun on my face, or smelling outside air, or seeing another living person except through windows, at a great distance. And I began to understand what had happened. The house had purchased me, not the other way around. It had been waiting, a patient, collector of souls, for someone like me, someone broken enough to lose themselves, someone alone enough that nobody would notice they disappeared. The woman wanted to leave. The house wanted a new resident. The transaction was almost complete. I started writing this document in a moment of clarity, or what I tell myself is clarity. I'm leaving it here with the hope that somehow, someone will find it, will understand, will be warned. If you're reading this, and you're thinking about buying a house that seems too good to be true, in a neighborhood where the properties are just slightly too well maintained, where everything feels just slightly off, don't buy it. Because the house isn't for sale, the occupancy is, and the woman in the basement is very patient.